Mic check 1 2 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and I put out a video the other day talking about the PlayStation 4 and how I don't think the console is going anywhere anytime soon. And a lot of the comments, that video got a lot of comments on it, and a lot of the comments that I saw kept referring to the PlayStation 4 as the PlayStation 2 of this generation. And when I think about the PlayStation 2 and what set the PlayStation 2 apart from its, I guess, its peers of its generation, a few things come to mind. And I try to see if the PS4 had the same level of competition or equivalent competition that the PlayStation 2 had, or if it had more competition. Now, when you look at the console like the PS2, when the PlayStation 2 came out originally, its biggest competitors were the Xbox, the GameCube, and the Sega Dreamcast. Because at this time in history, for those of you who might be too young to remember this or know this, back then it was more than just Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo that was coming out with consoles. You had a number of console makers back in the 90s, and then as the 90s um wore down to a close and we started getting into the 2000s, we saw a lot of console makers kind of drop out. Neo Geo stopped making consoles. I'm not sure when the Neo Geo Pocket came out, but they stopped. They took their hat out of the console war. um you know uh Turbo Graphics, which I'm not sure if Atari made that, but I can't remember who the maker of the Turbo Graphics 16. But they took, they didn't release any systems later on into the 90s and into the 2000s. So pretty much the Sony PlayStation 2 generation was the last generation, unless I'm wrong. Someone could let me know down in the comments. But that was the last time we saw a big four instead of a big three. That was the last time we saw the big four being Nintendo, Sega, Sony, and Microsoft, um, in the race to see who could be, the best when it came to console creation. And at that time, you know, although Nintendo was still, a powerhouse in the gaming industry, it never really felt like the GameCube was able to hold up or hold its own against the PlayStation 2. In fact, at that time, it seemed like the GameCube could barely hold its own against the Xbox. And if it wasn't for Nintendo's iconic franchises like the Mario games, the Kirby games, Mario Kart, things like that, Zelda, I don't know if the GameCube even would have been able to compete, to be quite honest with you. And that's one of the reasons why when the GameCube became such a fad during lockdown, it kind of threw me off, because those of you who grew up in that generation, the GameCube was not the console that people were running for back then. Um, and quite as it's kept, the Dreamcast, honestly, was a major player in that era. It's just that the Dreamcast kind of released. I can't remember specifically. You guys can let me know down in the comments, but I want to say it was a little bit earlier than some of these systems. And despite being like a half generation ahead of like the Xbox and the GameCube and the PlayStation 2, the Dreamcast graphics held its own. Like Sega held their own with those Dreamcast games, against like Sony's PlayStation 2 and the GameCube and stuff. It was almost there. I don't want to say it was right there, but Dreamcast graphics were almost on par with the PlayStation 2. So Sony, at the end of the day, they did have competition, because not only were they competing against for the consoles, but the games that were released on those consoles were sick. You got to remember, that was the first time we saw games like Halo, the first time we saw games like Super Smash Brothers, Mario Sunshine. I mean, Sony had their work cut out for them if they weren't going to be dominant, but Sony, the PS2 held its own. I mean, selling over 100 million consoles, having some of the most iconic games like the Grand Theft Auto series, Vice City. When you start to think about, some of the more iconic games that came out on the PlayStation 2, Sony definitely held its own. And I think when you look at the PlayStation 2, while it is a large library, the Sony PlayStation 2 is the one library that I would say wasn't as much fluff. The PlayStation 2 has a ton of quality mid-tier games. And I don't know if there's another console that has as many quality mid-tier games as the PlayStation 2. So when you look at the competition, when you look at the library, I mean, PlayStation 2 is definitely in a GOAT status to me. Now, when you look at a console like the PlayStation 4, perhaps, the PlayStation 4 was released, and its main competition at the time, or has been, the Xbox One, as well as the Xbox Series, and then the Nintendo Switch, right? You could probably say that Wii U was its competition for a while, but its main competition has been the Switch, which I think the Switch officially outsold it a couple of years ago. So when you look at the landscape, the PS4 didn't have the same type of competition, but it definitely did have competition, but it was different, right? Because at the point that the Sony PlayStation 4 came out, there really wasn't much of a differentiator in terms of graphics, right? Like, you weren't gonna win the console wars with graphics, because graphics on the Xbox One were great, graphics on the PS4 were great, and graphics on the Switch were good enough to compete with the PlayStation 4. And I think once again, it came down to games and it came down to the library. Now, at this point, I don't know if there is a library more large or more diverse than the Switch library. I really don't know. The Switch library is deep. However, the PlayStation 4 is definitely a solid runner-up in terms of the library. And while the Sony PlayStation doesn't have like the Mario games, there are some PS4 and PlayStation exclusives that help to set the PS4 apart from the Switch. Now, the bigger difference, in my opinion, between the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 2 is that, as large as the PlayStation 2's library was, it did have, like I said, a large number of quality mid-tier games. Whereas I feel like with the PlayStation 4, while it does have a really large and amazing library, the PS4 definitely has a lot more fluff than the PlayStation 2. Both consoles have their fair share of sports games, so I'm not going to count sports games. But the PS4 does have a lot of like fluff slash shovelware games, because a lot of the same fluff games that came out for the Switch were also released on the PlayStation 4. And then Sony themselves just have a bunch of like fluff games. So you kind of have to watch what you're getting when you buy PS4 games, because it's easy to get sucked into the vortex of just buying a bunch of trash. And I think that's the main difference for me. Where the PS4 is gonna stack up in history, that will be seen. But if we have to judge it off of its library, it does have a great library, has a solid library. But I don't know if the PS4's library will be able to differentiate it from its peers of its generation, the way the PlayStation 2's library was definitely a huge differentiator from the Xbox, the GameCube, and the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast for sure couldn't hold a candle to the Dreamcast and GameCube for that matter couldn't hold a candle to PS2 in terms of the library and the diversity. Xbox, I want to say they did a better job with their library, but it still wasn't it just still wasn't where the PS2 was. But I'm interested to know your thoughts. This comparison, do you think that the PlayStation 4 is the PS2 of this generation? Do you think it holds the same weight? Do you think it has the same type of competition? And do you think that it will cement itself in history the same way the PlayStation 2 did? I'm interested to know your thoughts. It's the Y2K Collector. Happy Hump Day. Hopefully, you had a good Wednesday. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take it easy.